And it's 10:30. Today's seminar is presented by Sammy Lee.
So just to kind of, I guess, to be, in line with kind of like what's happening around the world, now that COP27 is just kind of around the corner in some sense, I guess, because we finally hit November, I decided that we should maybe take a look at this paper that basically kind of made the two connections between marine litter and climate change. I'm assuming, I don't want to sound so patronizing because I'm sure many of us who are here today are actually experts at marine litter, probably more than me in many ways. But basically what this paper does is that it puts those two concepts of marine litter and climate change and how they're inextricably connected into they basically put them into words. We all have this inkling that those two, climate change and marine litter, are inextricably related and connected, but I guess the research behind that is still a little bit I think everyone just assumes that it's so obvious that there's not a lot of papers that actually like delve into it. And this paper kind of does that. In many ways, it does a really good job in that it kind of provides that sort of overview of how those two things are related. But there are some kind of instances where it would have been nicer if they kind of, dug deeper. So anyways, that's kind of the premise to all of this. And I just wanted to do like a quick overview and a summarization of this paper, just in case you haven't maybe read it or haven't gotten a chance to take a look at it. So without further ado, let me just start. Okay, so to start with the abstract here, I guess it'll just be good to just kind of highlight some of the things to give you a bigger picture of what this paper talks about. This paper is initially talking about the global issues of climate change and marine litter are interlinked, and understanding these connections is essentially key to managing how their combined risks are affecting the marine biodiversity and ultimately the society. We all know that marine litter is a threat multiplier in many ways, and that with additional stressors such as climate change, they could cause far greater damage than if they were to have occurred in isolation. And so while that's the case, on the other hand, climate change can also lead to increased inputs of litter into the marine environment, and the presence of marine litter can also undermine the climate resilience of marine ecosystems. So that's just kind of the gist of like what this paper is trying to say. And kind of in conclusion, what they initially realized is that the ecosystem resilience approaches that integrate climate change with other local stressors offer a suitable framework to basically mitigate the risk and to steer, coordinate, and prioritize research and monitoring, as well as management, policy planning, and action to effectively tackle the combined risks and impacts from climate change and marine litter. So that's kind of like the general summarization of this paper. I know that this image right here is really tiny, but fret not, because they have a much bigger figure that that essentially shows the same thing later on in the paper, which we'll be reviewing. So yeah, as you can see, basically what I've done is, instead of creating different PowerPoint slides, summarizing this paper, I just kind of highlighted the actual paper so that, when you get a chance to maybe go through the paper on your own at a later time, you could kind of like compare some of like my highlighted areas with some other areas that you probably found to be a little bit more interesting. So that was kind of like the reason behind to all of this. And also to give you a heads up, throughout school and law school, I've been notoriously known to be like one of those people who loved color coordinated highlighters. And so, yes, as you can see, that is clearly reflected here. the yellow highlights are kind of like the general, I guess, key points, but throughout the paper, I also use like green and blue, green being kind of more of like the more important aspects, and then just kind of like the sub important, I guess, sections or headings are in blue. So as you know, as I'm going along, that might help you to figure out what all this color coordination means. So right, as many of you probably know, since the mid 2010s, there has been an increase in a number of studies, and yeah, sorry, it's probably best for you to like follow this along with the actual paper, which you probably should have had access to. So, okay. So going back to the introductions, since the mid-2010s, there's been an increase in the number of studies and media articles that basically consider the climate change, the nexus of climate change and marine litter together rather than in isolation. And I think that's really important to highlight here, because oftentimes a lot of these studies have been kind of conducted in silos, and kind of merging those two different sectors and kind of considering them together has been a really important development, I think, in this field. And it is something that needs to be probably looked into further. And that's what this paper is essentially trying to do. So following a review of literatures, some general overarching connections were made. And first is that climate change can lead to increased inputs of litter into the marine environment. Second, the presence of marine litter undermines resilience of marine ecosystems and climate change. And third, the cumulative effect of marine litter and climate change can lead to greater negative impacts on species and habitats, and ultimately on ecosystem services. Aside from this, they also realize that further linkages between climate change further linkages have also been observed. For example, climate change influencing the distribution and the rate of breakdown of litter in the marine environment has also been observed. And I think that was kind of peppered throughout the paper in terms of how this all links together. So as many of you probably know, the linkages can be either direct or indirect, and a major direct negative linkage to climate change and marine litter is probably fossil fuel-based plastics causing direct emissions of greenhouse gases throughout their life cycle. This is a no-brainer for many of us. And then there's another impact that's, I guess, relatively an indirect impact, but could also be direct in many cases, where alterations in key species and habitats in coastal and marine environments caused by biodiversity coming into contact with marine litter is also a negative impact. And also plastics cascading across marine food webs and penetrating biochemical cycling processes could be another. So in this study, as I mentioned before, it talks about the interactions between climate change and marine litter and the compounding global risks to biodiversity and societies based on a review of the literature. So the authors of this paper basically reviewed a whole bunch of literature to kind of, I guess, basically group them into different categories, and also kind of see the commonalities and kind of create them into like a neat, organized, I guess, manner. And so that's what this paper really is. In section 2, which we'll be probably reviewing first, is where they talk about how they, the process that they followed to undertake this systematic literature review. And then in section 3, they talk about the findings. And one neat thing about this paper that really was kind of like the best, I think, aspect of this paper was that they also included this scenarios, or like these like broad range of scenarios that kind of directly create those linkages between climate change and marine litter using, specific examples from different marine systems. So later on, you'll see like the linkages that they've made in like the deep sea and the Mediterranean and so forth, which I thought was pretty neat. And then in section 4, we'll discuss some of the risks posed to societies and economies and also look at how human behavior further influences the interaction between climate change and marine litter. And then they kind of wrap things up by offering key recommendations and basically, kind of tell you how they concluded that ecosystem resilience approaches is the most suitable framework that's needed to kind of tackle these two global problems. All right, so first looking into how they carried out the study. So like I said, they did a whole bunch of literature reviews, and they said that there wasn't any predefined criteria that they applied, and no results were excluded based on any like geographic location or oceanic regions, climatic region, date, or type of impact. However, there was some sort of language barrier that they encountered, which obviously meant that, these literature reviews were only, they only considered the ones that were available in English. And we could probably talk about this later on and maybe open up for discussion after we've gone through the entire paper. But I'm assuming there, especially I think in the Asia Pacific, there might have been probably some sort of lots of good documentation or literature that they probably didn't have access to because of this language barrier. And I don't know how much of an impact that had on that had on the overall, I guess, result of the study. So looking at the set of keywords that they used, so they kind of divided into the primary, secondary, and tertiary keyword searches here. The primary was obviously just kind of like your keywords that they probably like plug and chugged in like different search engines, and also they talk about like some of the search engines that they used. And then the secondary is kind of adding a little bit more to that. So using a little bit more descriptive words that will narrow their searches. And then tertiary is basically doing the same thing, but to like more of a narrower approach. What was really interesting is that, so they were very, I guess, I think they really cared about the results that were rendered through this literature review. So each person's initial spreadsheet was screened by one of the other two people that was also part of the study. And then they also used their expert judgment when it came to deciding whether or not they should include or exclude some studies. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe that's something a little bit too obvious to mention, but I thought that it was a little bit worth highlighting, because I think that sort of having that background knowledge and having that ability to kind of execute that expert judgment is probably going to affect how good of a literature review you're going to do, just because you have that sort of foundational knowledge that you could always fall back on, and kind of pick and choose the literature that should be included or does not have to be included. So I think that was pretty important that the people that were part of this research all had that expert knowledge. So what ended up happening was that they ended up getting a total of 305 bibliographic references that were all included in this final list of references. And basically they just kind of really reviewed these bibliographic references to kind of come up with how these literature review really talk about the connection between climate change and marine litter. So, so since 2003 to 2015, there's been a steady yearly increase in the number of studies looking at climate change and marine litter. But then there's like this very pronounced jump that happens in 2018. So if you look at figure 1A here, you kind of see this like gradual increase, and then like you kind of see a little bit of a noticeable increase in 2015, and then come like 2018, you see this really high jump, and then like in 2020 it like really hit like I don't know, the apex of like climate change and marine litter studies, and then it's kind of been dwindling down a little bit, but I don't know if that sort of trend is I guess worth mentioning. But anyway, so that's just kind of the trend that this study has been taking on. And the majority of studies found in the search correspond to peer review articles, followed by technical reports and books. So if you see the little pie graph, the pie here, the publication type, the literature review that they referenced the most was peer reviewed, and then followed by like technical reports and then books. Next, they also included 12 public media communication pieces, which were also included in the final list. And I'm assuming that the 12 public media communication pieces were probably this qualitative study here. I'm not quite sure, but I think that's what that was meant to be. And then almost half of all entries, which were about 143, were found were desk-based review studies, followed by observational studies based on empirical observations. And a total of 115 studies were found to approach the topic from a global scale, followed by regional, local, and country scale studies. And in terms of geographical regions, studies for the Pacific appear to be the most numerous. So this all indicates what I just said. So then what happens is that they found this through this literature review. They ended up finding a couple of results, and one of them is, so the results are all highlighted in green, like I told you, and then like under each result, like for instance, the result here, climate change influences the source and pathways of global marine litter. So this is one of the results that they've found. And under that, there's also sub results, I guess, the heavy rain events. So I'll go through each of them, but anyways, that's what the blue corresponds to. So first, taking a look at the first result that they found. Climate change influences the sources and pathways of global marine litter. This is obviously something that many of us already know. Anthropogenic litter enters the environment from land-based sources, but also from sea-based sources as well. But I thought it was good that they mentioned that in some areas, marine litter can originate from ocean-based sources as a result of oceanic and climatic processes. And I think this is really important because, as many of you may or may not know, there are some countries, I think including South Korea, where sea-based sources are probably just as much or even more than land-based sources. And because they're, those type of comparative studies I don't think, are yet to really come out with exact numbers. It's really hard to say. I think that land-based sources are the predominant driving force in terms of the sources of marine litter, because sea-based sources are just as important and just as probably gargantuan in number. So yeah, I thought that was really important for them to kind of include that there. And also they found that different ways in which climate change can impact the sources, distribution, final fate of marine litter, and the combined impact of those will have an effect on marine diversity and ecosystems, and ultimately societies and economies. So this is another thing that they found. And they create this really handy dandy chart here that kind of connect the dots for you really in many ways. And I thought this is like a really good visual in terms of really kind of extracting, I guess, the findings that they found through the literature review into kind of more of an easier to understand flowchart. And so we could take a look at that a little bit later. But anyways, so another thing that they found was that so the heading here is climate change influencing the sources and patterns in global marine litter, right? So the climate change drivers that impact these sources and distributions and fate of marine litter are as follows. So heavy rain events and runoff is one of them. And as you probably know, litter input into waterways and also heavy periods of rain or storm events often create the perfect recipe for a lot of marine litter to to really accumulate. And according to a study that was done in 2020 by Hitchcock, there was microplastic abundance in urban Cooks River estuary in Australia, and they found that there was an increase from 400 particles per cubic meter up to 70,383 particles per cubic meter after 2 days of heavy rain. So that's a noticeable jump in terms of the amount of microplastics that were accumulated after 2 days of heavy rain. And also, in addition to that, rainfall onto hard surfaces such as tarmacked roads can result in increased amounts of microplastics from road paints, tire fragments, and degraded litter entering waterways via storm water systems. I think this might be a little bit up the alley of our colleagues and from Tangaroora Blue, just because I know that they've been doing a lot of study on like tire fragments, and this I think highlights that issue here as well. Also, there was in addition of direct input of sewage containing microplastics into rivers and estuaries as wastewater systems overflowed during storms. So that was the situation in Australia. They also took a look at a study that was done in the Caribbean coast of Colombia, where a primary source of beach litter corresponded to litter transported by rivers combined with human activity. This was particularly problematic for this area because 46% of the municipalities along the Magdalena River do not have disposal systems for solid waste, and this really creates that sort of unfortunate environment for marine litter to get easily transported. And another study that was carried out in the northeast coast of India found that marine litter abundance was higher during monsoon season rather than the post-monsoon season. So these are some of the studies that illustrated how heavy rain events and runoff could really be climate change drivers. Another climate change driver that they identified was sea level rise and coastal erosion. Sea level rise, along with extreme storm events driven by climate change, cause shorelines to erode and retreat globally. These type of coastal erosions also include secondary diffuse source of marine litter, and it is likely that coastal erosion processes may exhume buried items and release them into the marine environment. So I think it's almost So in addition to not only transporting marine litter, it also exhumed buried items as well, and kind of creating an even worse scenario in terms of marine litter distribution. They talk about coastal dune vegetation and how these dune vegetations trap sediment. And also they intercept and trap litter when items are moved landwards from beach by wind and waves, promoting litter burial. And so over time, these litter that got buried through the help of wind and spray, they transport sediment, and the dune ridge rises. And then until the waves or coastal erosion exhume buried items, and until the waves and coastal erosion happens, these exhumed buried items get dispersed into the marine environment. And so yeah, these type of so this type of transportation of marine litter is also a driving, these type of sea level rise and coastal erosion is a driver of marine litter, and also human interventions such as waste dumping and dune nourishment also add to this burial of large amounts of litter. So in addition to that, also smaller plastic particles trapped in sediments get released back into the water column as coastlines retreat and as sea levels rise. This similar situation also happened in the Arctic continental and coastal shelf sediments due to the sea ice retreating and also increased wave energy. Another thing that they mentioned here is that historic landfill sites are also problematic because a lot of times these landfill sites are found on low-lying flood or coastal plains due to the ease of access to large populations and low land value, which creates them to be highly susceptible to flooding and erosion. A study that was actually done to highlight this was carried out in the UK, where they studied 2 different landfill sites on the bank of the Thames estuary and excess. And they found that if only one waste cell, so the samples were taken from these 2 different landfill, that was one was in Hadley Marsh and the other one was in Lee Marshes. And the study found that if only one waste cell from Hadley Marsh was to erode, approximately 71,400 cubic meters of solid material would be released into the estuary, including 2,900 to 3,860 tons of plastic as well. So another climate change driver is extreme weather events and other natural disasters. Heavy rainfall and extreme weather events contribute to pulse generation of marine litter that produce large amounts of debris in a relatively short time. This was something new to me, but I didn't know that earthquakes have been noted to generate the most pulse type litter, followed by tsunamis and cyclones. And I also didn't know that cyclones are the only climate related issue. So this is, I guess, a novel finding on my part. And I thought this is really interesting because I think cyclones have been kind of in the news a lot more frequently because due to these extreme weather changes and weather events. And of course, storm surges and waves associated with tropical cyclones usually transport a large amount of pollutants from the mainland to the marine environment, or from offshore and into coastal areas. And I think this is probably why it's also probably so closely related and also much more highlighted in the area of marine litter. The paper talks about 2 instances, Hurricane Irma and also the cyclonic storm Nivar. And in the case of Hurricane Irma, it caused moderate to very severe damages to 47% of buildings. As for Nivar, there was a study that was done to assess the distribution of plastic particles in beach sediments in the affected area. And it found that particles of all sizes were more abundant after the cyclone. So quickly going through, just because I'm kind of short on time here, another climate change driver that was mentioned was wind, droughts, and heat waves. I guess this is pretty self-explanatory in many ways, just because, due to extreme weather, there's a lot more gustier winds and droughts and heat waves, and they also happen much more frequently. I'm sure many of you already knew that. But these are certainly drivers of climate change, and it certainly affects marine litter because changes in these conditions due to these extreme weather has an impact on the marine environment and diversity as well, and especially when it comes to tourism, where where these type of events really impact the tourist locations. It could kind of have additional knock-on effects when it comes to like the tourist economy and the industry as well. Another thing that you mentioned was recreational fishing, but this is also, again, something that could be easily affected by climate change because the availability and the location of target species could also shift or change. Another climate change driver is ocean circulation and trade winds. They talk about the winds and currents that were happening along the coast of Qatar. You could probably read more about it later on. They also talk about this study that was done in Seychelles as well, that essentially found out that the Southeast Asia and Somalian coasts were found to be the likely primary source of flotsam washed up in the island, with the vast majority of them being plastics. So another finding that they found while reviewing the literature was climate change influencing the rate of breakdown of marine litter. Many of us already know that climate change has an impact on the entry of marine litter into the marine environment, but it also has an impact on how long it persists. Some of the factors that contribute to this are high temperatures, light exposure, and abrasion, and also climate-driven temperature warming, as well as altered wave conditions, play a role where they accelerate future plastic breakdown rates in the marine environment. And mechanical fragmentation of solid waste is greater in high energy environments. That's kind of a no-brainer, as large waves and strong currents cause abrasion and break up larger particles, while smaller fragments suspended in the water column, while they keep smaller fragments suspended in the water column for extended periods. Solar radiation is also considered a primary factor when it comes to weathering polymers. And this is another problematic area in the sense that, this is how microplastics are created and are dispersed throughout time. They also briefly talk about how when we're talking about macroplastics, vis-a-vis animals and birds and turtles, we usually talk about entanglement, injury, or ingestion hazards. But it also mentions how microplastics can also be problematic to these creatures, because marine litter is not just macroplastics, it also includes microplastics, and marine litter both release and absorb chemicals, and these chemicals bioaccumulate in marine food webs. And if climate change results in faster degradation of plastics, this may cause more release of these contaminants, and the subsequent impacts to marine biota and human health can also be accelerated due to these connections. So it also talks about how, due to these connections and due to these potential accelerations, it could also help exacerbate food security for a lot of vulnerable communities, including the Pacific Island states, and how climate change could also aggravate chemical pollution linked to litter in the future. Another finding that they found was how combined marine litter and climate change have greater negative impact than either acting alone. So, and here they talked about, so they, I think they mentioned some sobering numbers here. Like, for instance, according to a review by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the impact of marine debris on biodiversity is substantial, resulting in half of the species out of a total of 663 reportedly suffering impacts. And a more recent study further suggested that an estimated 30% of individual seabirds, 4% of marine mammals, and 32% of marine turtles have plastics in their stomach. These are all, they're kind of illustrating. Well, they're sharing these numbers so that you could kind of connect the two together, and kind of make your own, I guess, judgment as to how marine litter and climate change have greater impact collectively, rather than when compared to have impacting separately, I guess. In this case, they talk about seabirds as well, and they talk about the capacity of marine mammals. And they also talk about how the capacity of marine mammals, their capacity to adapting to climate change is poorly understood, but many of us already know that extreme weather and human intervention have been affecting key habitats and breeding grounds that have been known to cause strandings, drowning, and disease, resulting in distribution shifts and poor reproductive success. So although we don't really have the exact understanding and well, more so a clear understanding of the capacity of marine mammals adapting to climate change, we already know that there is that sort of relation there. So they talk about here, and then they talk about how in fish, they also, there haven't been any exact reports about how microplastics or nanoplastic ingestions have been, I guess, killing them off, but they have found that there was decrease in locomotor and foraging activities and so forth, and so there is a sort of negative impact. One thing that I thought was a little bit unfortunate was how they didn't. I feel like they could have done a much better job in terms of really creating that sort of, or showcasing that direct link, or that showcasing the direct comparison of how when marine litter and climate change combined could have a greater impact, a greater negative impact than either acting alone. I feel like that could have been a bit more clear to kind of help the reader see that direct comparison. But I think it kind of leaves it up to the reader to make that jump. So quickly moving forward, I know I'm taking time from the discussions that could happen afterwards, but climate change and litter increased spread and establishment of invasive non-native species, including pathogens, are also climate change drivers. You could probably look that into this section here. And then marine litter undermining the resilience of marine ecosystems of climate change was another thing that they found. This is something that really ties in with their conclusion later on about how, marine litter not only impacts the marine system in general, but it also impacts and undermines the resilience that marine ecosystems need to have to combat climate change. And so that's another extra layer of marine litter being problematic. So like I said before, I think this is the highlight, honestly, of the paper, is that they talk about these cases and they divide it into these regions. They look at the deep sea, remote islands, Mediterranean, Caribbean, and polar regions. And they talk about how, so this column right here is like the climate change, and this is marine litter, and how large knowledge. So how much time do I have? Oh, okay. So I'm just going to leave this up to you for you to take a look later on. But basically what they do is they talk about the climate change factors and the marine litter factors, and how these two are interconnected, and how these two together create this sort of condition. So I thought that was interesting because it's a little bit more context specific in terms of the region. And I think that's worth checking out. So scrolling ahead, one of the discussion points that they pose in the paper is the socioeconomic risk. I think I briefly mentioned this about how the risk of marine plastics and climate change are also interlinked with ecological, social, and economic systems as well. And another thing that they mention is human behavior driving interactions between marine litter and climate change. I think this is really interesting because one thing to point out in this section was that there was a survey in both Australia and in the UK where the surveyees basically said that they were very concerned over marine plastics, but pro-environmental attitudes in terms of marine litter did not necessarily translate into action. And I think this is often the case for many of us where, you know, we all say that we're very much interested or very concerned about the marine environment, but I think a lot of times our actions don't really, you know, follow suit. And another thing that they'd mentioned were policy frameworks for effective actions and solutions. This kind of gets into the nitty-gritty recommendations that were proposed by UNEP, and I'm sure you could go back and revisit these because they've cited a lot of these actions and solutions that were proposed. But they talk about some of the recommendations by UNEP about how you know, there needs to be policy frameworks that are, you know, that focus on prevention, but also like on generation and spread of solid waste, and how frameworks need to be specifically designed to address marine litter and so forth. Yeah, so that's pretty much like all of this section really here is basically from the UNEP recommendations. And one thing that I really wanted to mention here is as an example of a country that did a really good job integrating marine litter and climate change was Scotland. Although, you know, due to Brexit, they're no longer under the auspices of the EU. They basically evaluated their policy targets and criteria using different frameworks and making sure that those frameworks, so for instance, to be a little bit more explicit here, they use the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, Good Environmental Status and Water Framework Directive, and also their Zero Waste Plan and Climate Change, and kind of evaluating under these different policy targets essentially ensured that you know, their policies were being effective and that they were addressing areas that needed attention. So I thought that was really interesting that they really highlighted Scotland as an example of a good, I guess, case of policy integration. So if we just jump to conclusions and recommendations, this paper essentially says that actions that reduce or avoid either of the three risk factors, which they have pointed out as being hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, should contribute to controlling and mitigating those risks and therefore building up ecosystem resilience. And their conclusion is essentially that ecosystem resilience frameworks that incorporate both climate change and marine litter create that space for effective action to be taken, and that's basically where we should be heading. And that's about it. Sorry, I wasn't really keeping track of the time, and I apologize. This paper was a little bit long, and I found a lot of parts to be interesting, and I think I might have spent too much time in the beginning. But yeah, I'll accept any comments or questions if you have any.
Thank you, Semi, for presenting this paper. This paper is like a narrative, explanatory, so it's for me too difficult to read all contents. Frankly, I read up to 10 pages, but very interesting and comprehensive. If you have questions, please raise your hand or turn on your microphone. Could anyone have questions or comments?
I have one. Thank you, Semi. In this paper, they told that the case of Scotland government policy is a good example linking climate change and marine litter, but I could not find any special features in the policy of Scotland government because it's a kind of the 병렬, 나열. It's just it's just a list of policies on marine litter and climate change. I could not find a linkage or integration in Scotland case. What do you think about that, about the Scotland case?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point that you made. And quite unfortunately, I feel like that's something that could be applied to this paper as a whole. Honestly, I feel like they do a really good job of just kind of putting the pieces together and categorizing certain different papers and researches and different themes together and put it in a nice package, but they don't really do any sort of in-depth analysis, or they don't go that extra mile and do the legwork of, talking about why this is important or why this is the case that they wanted to showcase. And it really leaves much more to be desired in many ways. And I think this Scotland example is also one of those things. If I go back to that area, the paper where they talk about the Scottish government, right? So what they did here, can everyone see my screen, by the way? Yeah. So what they did here was they talk about how it's more, they focus more on like the procedural aspect of like some of the instruments or the frameworks that they used, right? But then they don't necessarily talk about how these were used or how they were integrated to create that sort of exemplary policy integration to tackle marine litter and climate change simultaneously. So that certainly is, I guess, a little bit unfortunate. But yeah, I feel like that this paper in general, there is a lot more left to be desired in terms of not really making that in-depth analysis as to why we should be taking marine litter and climate change together collectively instead of two separate elements. So yeah, I agree with you. They don't really talk about it, but they just mentioned the frameworks and the legislative acts that they've relied on.
Then could I ask 소장님, 정명? In Marine Scotland, the 2012, did you check that thing? Or OSPA 2022? In the paper on page 13, the referred one is Marine Scotland 2012 is old one. So I'm asking you.
Yeah, I did not check the contents of that paper, but I expect some integrated policy.
In this paper,
in
there
this
is no
section.
There is no explanation here. So I'm wondering on Marine Scotland 2012, what are the contents, and it's old one, so we have to check renewed one. And OSPA policy. Here, 3 international conventions is like Basel conventions, something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
Like 3 conventions, okay. This paper is comprehensive and narrative, so we have to check the report paper. But they at the end one interesting or serious thing is on page 4, study type. Most study paper are reviewed in other areas. In other areas, studies are more focused on quantitative or qualitative studies, but on this subject, reviews paper are the most. So the title is huge and on the global thing. I mean, usually papers are published on each section or in each area, and later on, reviewed papers are emerged. But here, reviewed paper are the most, though it's strange. And scale is understandable. Global and location are global because it's big. It covers a global scope range. And the first part of this paper, they mentioned climate change paper are 4 times or many times as marine litter sector. So the reviewed paper are focused on climate change and deal with marine litter. I guess. So, frankly, this paper gave me some scope or understanding globally or broadly, but in detail. I think we should check again the report paper. Any
Right.
other comments or opinions?
Yeah, like you said, I think I know I said this before, but I think this paper does a much better job in terms of like covering the breadth, in terms of like the depth. Sorry, the breadth more so than the depth of the subject matter. And I think that's probably what they were going for, I think. I don't necessarily think that they were trying to delve into one specific area of the nexus between climate change and marine litter in detail, but they wanted to give a more broader and unfortunately probably a shallower view just because of the spectrum of the nexus between climate change and marine litter. So yeah, I think that's, I guess in this paper's defense, that's kind of like what this paper was probably going for. And that's probably what we could only glean from this paper. So yeah, I think that's one of the shortcomings, but then at the same time, I think it was probably not the objective.
But, one point from me, the important thing is the climate change and thinking about climate change and the marine litter. Climate change, people think climate change is the most serious problem on the globe, and less people think less about marine litter, for my opinion. But climate change, we feel it, we feel global warming, but later on, we may feel same way on the marine litter. So we should focus on marine litter more and thinking about the future impact of the marine litter. So it's like a precautionary step or policy we should need. And for that policy, I think more private sector like company, they should focus on the impact of their products like single-use plastics or single-use plastics or consumers packaging, multi-packaging. We can find many packaging level, several layers. For that, I think a more powerful policy on national level or international level we need. That's my point. That's my thinking.
Right. The paper does talk about how some countries have taken that sort of approach on tackling a specific issue, such as single-use plastics. So it does mention that having these sort of legislative actions tackling single-use plastics is also another way to curb that sort of production and mitigation of marine litter. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And this paper also talks about that too.
Any other comments?
Any other questions?
I have one thing to share with you. Ocean is now conducting a research for quantification of greenhouse gas emission from marine litter for Korean government. We are trying to find out the way to organize the statistics from marine litter greenhouse gas in Korea following the IPCC guideline. So we want to find out some good case studies or good reference from any other countries or any other cases in quantification of greenhouse gas emission from marine litter, but we could not find any previous study. So when we complete our research, we can show you how we can calculate the greenhouse gas emission from marine litter in national level. Let me know when we are ready. Thank you.
Okay, if there is no question or opinion, comment, could I wrap up the seminar? Okay, and we have to schedule next seminar, December 6th. Could anyone present the same on the day? Jason, please.
Yes.
Okay, could you send in the seminar to share that with participants?
Okay, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for participating today. See you next month. Bye-bye.